Thank you. Welcome everybody, it's lovely to see you all here. I was just saying to Izzy that Wallingford had hurricane force winds forecast this morning, which I think is a glitch in the system. Fingers crossed, otherwise the house might not be there when I get back. So, for those of you who don't know me, which is probably most of you, my name's Sally White. I work for the Environment Agency. My kind of day-to-day job is in programme and contract management, which is a fancy term for project management. And I have been working for the past few years on the Thames Valley Flood Scheme, which some of you might have heard of. But my fun bit of my job is working on carbon and sustainability projects as well. But working on the Thames Valley Flood Scheme, which is looking at flood resilience across the whole of the Thames Valley, means that I've got a really good understanding of the challenge of reducing flood risk and addressing other environmental issues across the catchment. And I also understand that we can't do this alone. We're on this slide, number 4 down the list, which I think is generous. We have been fortunate enough to facilitate this work, but we understand that we all need to work together. None of us can meet the challenges that we're meeting on our own. But we also need to harness the passion and determination of people like Tim, and everyone else in this room, to get things moving. As we all know, passion and determination is not enough. We also need the policies, the tools and the evidence to make it work, and we need case studies and events like these. So hopefully if I click this button, here we go. So all I did here is just pulled out some of the relevant policies that we work under, which kind of demonstrate why the Environment Agency is interested in this kind of work. So hopefully you know that this piece of work is connecting together soil, connecting together carbon, and connecting together water resilience. So looking up on there, for the Environment Agency, our vision is a nation ready for and resilient to flooding and coastal change today, tomorrow, into the year 2100, which is a pretty big ambition. And is made up of loads of building blocks, which will hopefully get us there. And then looking at soil at the bottom there, so this is the DEFRA soil strategy. No, this is part of the government 25-year environment plan. And the thing that I wanted to pull out there is working with our, managing soils sustainably. And I think everyone in this room would have an interest in making sure that we can use soils sustainably. And then the Environment Agency has quite ambitious carbon goals. And as an organisation, we're aiming to reduce our carbon. We changed this in 2024, so I don't have it off the top of my head. A reduction in emissions by 45% by 2030. And just picking out that bit at the bottom is all about working with our partners to share learning and innovation to accelerate transition, and that applies to all of us, and that's why we're here today. So how did this project come about? So you'll hear a lot more about it as we go through the day, but for myself I mentioned that my fun bit of my job is being lucky enough to run a small programme of works which looks at sustainability and carbon reduction across the work of the Environment Agency. And we have a small amount of funding, as Tim mentioned, that's provided by the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, so again many thanks to them for being able to fund this work. In the programme, just for your interest, we've done lots of different things. So we've put solar panels on some of our pumping stations, we've installed CCTV to reduce travel and improve our carbon emissions during incidents, which is really relevant to what's going on out there at the moment. We've looked at e-bikes and provided e-tools and electric tools. We've done work on offsetting. Jeanette, who's in the room here, has developed a programme in partnership which is called Plastic Blitz, which is all about removing plastic and tracking plastic across the catchments. Joe, who's in the room, did some work a long time ago looking at the carbon balance of our NFM work. And the most recent one is the work you'll hear about today. And this all came about from a site visit for the Thames Valley Flood Scheme, and Tim talking so passionately about soils and what we should be doing more about it. So I've mentioned working together, and at this point I'm going to hand over to Izzy to talk about how we work with partners and the catchment partnerships in particular.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Izzy Edwards. I also work for the Environment Agency. I'm the catchment coordinator for the Evenlode and Windrush catchments. So that means working with partners, members of the catchment partnerships, to develop and get funding for projects. So as part of my role, I'm also the project liaison officer for the North East Cotswolds Farmer Cluster, both for their Evenlode landscape recovery project and also for this soil carbon and water resilience project. So in the Environment Agency, we find that working with partners is a really effective way of delivering environmental change. When you're working with local communities and local people, you're working with people who really care about the places that you're working in. So as a result of that, you're likely to get much better environmental results. So in this case, where we're working with the North East Cotswold Farmer Cluster, we have the opportunity to work with your network of about 140 farms across the Evenlode and Windrush, is that right?
164.
164 now, wow. That's amazing. And so for the Environment Agency, it's sometimes a bit difficult for us to work with farmers on projects looking into flood and environmental benefit when we're also their regulator. As you understand, they're probably a bit reticent sometimes to have Environment Agency coming out and doing that sort of work. But working with the farm cluster, because their mission is to expedite the agricultural transition to a more financially and environmentally sustainable system. It's a really good link organisation between our two sectors, yeah, really key partner for us. For this project, it's been brilliant working with the Farmer Cluster as well as Carbon Quester, Rothamsted Research and Atkins. They're a very ambitious and innovative team, and yeah, I'm really excited to hear more of the presentations today where we can kind of find out more about how we can better value soils and the role that they play in flood and drought. So thanks, I'll hand back over to you, Tim.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Is it your laptop that's crashed, or is it?
He just wants to show this forever.
That's working.
Yeah.
Just have a moment. Before I go into the introduction of the day, I've probably got some housekeeping to touch on. So, if there is a fire, and I believe there is not a fire plan today, lots of fire escapes all around you, and lavatories, cloakrooms, and so on at the back of this building. There's also a couple on the other side. If you haven't been to FarmED, just across the other side of the meadow. And yes, without any more ado, this is the shape of the day. I'm going to give a quick introduction to what we've been up to in the cluster for the last 3.5 years. Then we are going to do a dive into the soil carbon work and the prediction of the uplift of soil carbon. And then back to Atkins for the NFM modelling, natural flood management modelling. And then the fusion of those two pieces of work, how the soil carbon data is underpinning that modelling, and then finally the next steps and how we might take that forward. We will hopefully answer some of these questions or suggestions through the day, but ideally you should be thinking about taking measurements at farm scale and landscape scale at that, and baselining is key to all of this. As we've just heard, incentivising soil health to improve NFM, and then how NFM and carbon has to be, or can be, should be balanced across the other environmental outcomes that we're after on farm. So biodiversity being a key one, but also of course food production. So it's not necessarily one over the others, and how we can harmonise and optimise those across the farm and the catchment. So hopefully we will be answering some of those questions or comments. That is the format of today. We've had the presentation from EA, thank you very much. I'm going to touch on the Cotswold projects that we've been working on. Jon and Stefan will be talking a little bit more about baselining. Then we'll have a coffee break, and then into the meat of the conversation. A recap of the NEIRF 2 project, another Environment Agency funded project, predicting the uplift, and then into the NFM Studio, natural flood management modelling, and then exploration of how that all comes together. There will be quite an intense hour and a half in amongst all that, but your opportunity to answer or ask questions and comments and so on and challenge us a little bit is at 2 o'clock. We'll have a panel discussion, and so we really do welcome points of clarification and queries on some of the work as we go through, but if you've got big points to make and comments, we really welcome those in that 2 till 3 o'clock session. And then we'll touch on what's next for the cluster, and for those that haven't seen the farm, I really urge you to join us at 3:30 for a farm walk, and if you've already seen the farm, I urge you to see the farm walk, because it's never the same. And a quick introduction to the team. You've met Izzy, myself, Chris in the glass box at the back, Jon, and actually Stefan, if you'd like to stand up, just wave or turn around. So the Rothamsted team, it would be lovely to see Kathy here today, Kathy Thomas as well, who's been instrumental in a lot of this work. I'm sure you'll refer to her in your slides, but she's busy. And then Emily from Atkins. We also are missing Eleanor Miles, who works a lot with our projects. Unfortunately, she's got COVID and can't make it today, but Emily's been the engine behind this project. So, on to the Cotswold, North East Cotswold farmer cluster. This is our sort of 2021 vision. Don't expect you to read it all, but broadly speaking, it's around restoration of the farmed environment, recovery of soils, entrepreneurialism, baselining and mapping habitats, baselining other natural capital. Entrepreneurial thinking absolutely key, because the point 4 there, we want not just public funding, but we want to bringing in private finance as well. Evaluation of progress, critical, because you can't manage what you're not measuring, and then of course a lot of this at the moment is for public good, and so community outreach and engagement is critical to that and achieving some of the public money for that public good. So a quick snapshot through the cluster. It all started not very far away from here, over the hill, in 2020, pre-COVID, believe it or not, with a bunch of farms that wanted to connect up their river habitats and their meadows better. That quickly led to a facilitation fund application, and actually before then, nice to see Scott from CNL in the room, FIPL funding to get us underway. That's Farming Protected Landscape for the uninitiated. And that just gave us a little lever to organise some knowledge exchange events. And we got together and thought, well, what other projects could we do? Soil carbon at that time was this great mystery and unknown entity, but the promise of gold at the end of the rainbow was definitely there. And so everyone thought, well, let's go and baseline it. Meanwhile, whilst I was leaving my previous job, I was talking to Jon and Stefan at Rothamsted about some technology to get this landscape scale measurement of soil carbon and build this empirical data set. And we tested it here in the Cotswold cluster, North East Cotswold cluster, with 45 farms across the 19,000 hectares. So that was a really galvanising project that brought a lot of the farms together, measuring with the same method, so we could benchmark and have conversations around common soil types. Jon and Stefan will touch on this in a second. Nice to see Mike Kethwell here. Mike and Ian Wilkinson from FarmED. We're doing some work with, I want to say CEH, Richard Broughton. CEH? Yes. On the benefits of supplementary feeding, bird feeding. So we got a FIPL application in there, and continue now with supplementary bird feeding in the cluster scale. And then landscape recovery. I'm not going to go into details of that, but one of the pilots, I think the second pilot to get our development phase over the line, not necessarily over the line, but second project to get it back to DEFRA for quality assurance. So we're steaming ahead there. And meanwhile, we also not to neglect the Windrush, we baselined the floodplain meadows down the Windrush Valley. Some real sort of wonderful examples of MG4 community, the Great Burnett floodplain meadow community, still remaining a real rare plant community, still remaining in the Windrush Valley, that we wanted to baseline, make sure we understood it. Nice to see Anna, who did a lot of the work for that, and the glorious Cotswold grasslands project. And with that, of course, we didn't want to just measure the botanical interest there. We also took some soil carbon samples as well, and that's provided some wonderful data for today's conversation. And then a couple of other projects, deer population, venison supply chains, and trying to save the local abattoir as well. So those are all the farmer-led baselining measurement projects. But it's all very well having all this data. What are you going to do with it? So we then, meanwhile, working with a whole load of different stakeholders, trying to work out how we can build these partnerships to start to get revenues flowing and building a momentum around this farming transition and building on natural capital. So I'm not going to go through all of those. The key ones there are the second project there, predicting soil carbon uplift to support better finance. That was a NEIRF 2 project, Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, an EA DEFRA project grant fund. And that's where we took our baseline data and started to work out what would happen if you went under different management on that farm parcel, that field parcel, or went into a land use change. So that particular project is underpinned today. And then skipping through, as you can see, we've got a couple of infrastructure and utilities companies in there. Network Rail, Thames Water, great to have the Network Rail crew here. Thank you very much for making it over the border. And this is around how can we use the farmed environment to protect some of those assets, or reduce the risk on those assets and deliver some of those ecosystem services, whether that's flood attenuation and reduced flood risk, or in Thames Water's case, potentially enabling them a bit more space to treat some of that sewage that's coming out of their system. So those are the main partnerships I'm going to touch on here. And then, meanwhile, we've also been expanding into the Cherwell Valley with a new group that's just formed this year. And so now that is the Evenlode, Windrush and Cherwell Valley, so a good chunk of the Thames Basin, so we can start to aggregate this sort of impact. The micro impact, if you like, on a field scale is actually in as you aggregate it all together, having the potential to have a shift on the hydrograph and reduce the risk of flooding downstream. So we're not just talking about the communities of Ascot under Wychwood at the bottom here, but also how does the aggregation of these projects affect flooding downstream, whether that's the Didcot rail infrastructure or the communities in Oxford that seem to get hammered by flooding. In terms of building capacity and the future of the cluster, the landscape recovery project has enabled the development of that project, 2-year funding from DEFRA, has enabled us to think about the governance and structure of the North East Cotswold Farmer Cluster, which is a community interest company, and work out how we could govern all of these projects at a very large scale. Is that the right vehicle? Well, actually we decided with the help of some very expensive lawyers in London that no, it's not. And if we're going to receive some quite sizable amounts of investment into the catchment to enable this transition, we need to set up a new vehicle. So the Evenlode Landscape Recovery Vehicle is that. And that will enable that cash to flow and us to balance and return that investment into the land for the outcomes that we're after. We also very kindly supported by Rothschild Foundation and Esme Fairbairn over the next 3 years as well to start to build capacity and create a model that can then be shared and built out from this part of the world to others. And so that's just given us a bit of breathing space. You might have noticed I've stuck my phone in front of me here. We are going to be recording today. so if you've got a problem with that, let me know afterwards and we'll try and edit you out, but it's facing this way mostly. And this will go on to agroecology, which is a project from my past that we have been supporting with the cluster. We put up a few videos, and so if you don't catch it today or you miss something, you can go to agroecology and listen back and watch the slides again, and we will be disseminating this to a much broader group of farmers and farmer groups through that help. So that's a bit about that. I'm going to just flick through a couple of the maps of the cluster. You're going to see, John's going to talk through this again in a second. That is the carbon baselining project. Every one of those little blue dots is a 100 metres square field sample site, ably taken by Adrian, who's on the back row, running around in his quad and with the Cora, strong shoulders, and the different soil types across the landscape. This is the floodplain meadow project we did, so that snake all the way down the middle of the page is the Windrush, and the floodplain botanical surveys we did there. And this is the landscape recovery project area. So everything in blue is the focus area. Our project is a rivers and streams focus, so looking at water quality and flooding particularly. So as you can see, lots of focus in the floodplain. But of course, actually by the time it's in the floodplain, it's too late. So some other areas up catchment as well that we're trying to attenuate water or slow it down and improve that riparian habitat. Those are the interventions that we're doing with landscape recovery. We've sort of bucketed them into 12. The main reason I'm giving you this background is because we're looking for land use change in landscape recovery, and with that land use change, obviously, it's going to change the soil carbon or the hydrology or lots of other consequences, or management shifts in those field parcels. So, for instance, we've got number 4, lowland meadow. We could have an improved grass sward there with little species diversity. Now we could make some management changes to go into a more floristically enhanced, PHI, priority habitat inventory, sort of quality of habitat and plant species mix in that habitat. So what's the consequence, not just on the biodiversity, which we're measuring to achieve that, but on the hydrology and the carbon. So those are the different habitat interventions we're going after. As I say, this is predominantly for water quality and flooding reduction. And this is why, because our catchment, whilst it's lovely and Cotswold brashy, relatively dry on the tops above the limestone, by the time you get down the slopes, you're into some pretty heavy clay, and in the bottom, pretty unworkable when it gets wet. And so we have a few examples still of this sort of what looks like a beautiful scene from the beach, where the tide recedes and then the breaking occurs as the stream runs across the sand. Sadly, that's not a beach, it's an arable field. And so a pretty unworkable arable field if it maintains that level of saturation. So we're trying to give, if you like, an option to those farms still in the floodplain with arable to get out and put it under something that's perhaps more suitable in terms of land use and with all those other ecosystem benefits. And that is from January this year, I think, but it could be from autumn last year, spring this year, it could be from last week. These are arable fields still in the floodplain, and when it's dry, some of the best ground in the valley. It's lovely fine alluvial silts produce a cracking milling wheat crop, but I think this is probably the 10th or 11th time it's flooded in the last 3 years. And so there's a serious shift in what's a profitable field and what's unprofitable with the current management. So again, this landscape recovery hopefully will give the nudge and the opportunity to rethink the farm system, the opportunity to put the 10 or 15% that's underwater into a different land use, and then we can focus on the other 80-85% of the farm and make sure that's optimised for not just producing food, but also some of those other ecosystem services, capturing carbon and retaining water. So today, it's not about what's underwater in that picture, it's much more about the sort of the left-hand side the screen. How can we manage those fields and really retain water for those drought resilience, and slow the water before it gets into the valley floor? And yes, for the railway line boys, there is the Network Rail owned Cotswold line, and that gets a hammering every time it crosses the river, 27 times I think in the valley. And ultimately we're trying to avoid that sort of scene, which is houses flooding, roads being cut off, and this isn't yesterday, this is 2007. But interestingly, Dave Gasker in the room, proper data geek, and always has an eye on the rainfall. I think, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, 19 centimetres of rain on that July day in 2007. 10 days ago, whatever it was, Monday last week, it was 22 centimetres of rain in Chipping Norton on that day. So we have more rain 10 days ago than we did on that day that happened. But the difference was that I think we'd had record-breaking May, June, July rainfall beforehand, and the catchment was pretty saturated in July 2007. Whereas this year, whilst it's been a pretty miserable summer, it hasn't had that level of consistent, persistent rain. And so we weren't as saturated, so we didn't have these sorts of events on the right-hand side occurring. So for me, what can we do to help when we do have those big rainfall events, slow that water down before it gets to the catastrophic results that we see in that picture? And the obvious place is we hold it back up in the fields. That's, but we still need to produce food, so we still need to work those fields. And just finally, I think, before we move on to Jon, it's fairly obvious when we're in the valley floor what we should be doing. We saw that picture with the braiding across the arable field. This is a field that was arable until 18 months ago. And the last winter, and then again this year, without any cultivations, that soil scarring has ripped through the middle of that field. That's down to sort of alluvial sort of pebbles and previous sort of river channel stones and gravels. Purely because of the force of that river wanting to change its direction, not be penned into the incised, canalised channel that's on the left. And so, in situations like that, we're not really advocating trying to grow a crop of wheat, because most of it ends up downstream. So what do we do there? Well, it's floodplain meadows, or it's grazing marsh. We encourage that water back out into that floodplain and store it there. But what are the consequences on soil carbon and storage of water in the soils in a setting like that? So we're going to be looking at a couple of things today. One is, what can you do in an arable field to improve your soil carbon and retain more water for drought, or slow the water in winter or flood periods? And then also, what can we do if you're going into a land use change? So if we're going to grass in this particular instance, what's it going to do to the carbon, and how you manage that grass soil? Are you going after still quite high productivity in terms of biomass off that ground and forage, or are you going after more species rich floodplain meadow communities? So those are the sorts of questions we're going to be answering, and how does that then affect the Atkins Natural Flood Management Studio modelling? Over to Jon now to explain a little bit about the baselining project that we did a couple of years ago.
Okay, that's what time's coffee? 11?
11, yes.
Okay, perfect.
But we could have had it earlier
No, just about right.
Never knowingly run ahead of
Okay,
time.
so morning everybody. I'm Jon Storkey, working at Rothamsted Research. I'm actually a plant ecologist by training, but happily Stefan's here, who runs the soil analysis lab that I'll be talking about the data from. So we've been working with Tim for the past 2 or 3 years on the cluster, and working at a farm cluster scale, a landscape scale, it has a challenge, but it also has a fantastic opportunity. The challenge is we want to make life better, we want to make things better at scale. And in order to do that, we need to baseline, we need to know what's the current situation and what's the the gradient, if you like, the range of situations, into whether it be biodiversity or soil carbon, water holding capacity. So we need to baseline, and that's a real challenge at scale. How do we do that on 19,000 hectares in a cost-effective way that doesn't break the bank? Because we all know that ecological surveys, soil sampling is expensive. So that's the first thing, it's a real challenge. But the real opportunity is, if you think about what determines your species richness in a field, what determines your wheat yield, what determines your soil carbon, it's two categories. One is your environmental context. So what's your soil like, what's the soil depth, what's the soil texture, what's the rainfall, the climate. So your environmental constraints, if you like. And then the other category of things is what you can do, what's under your control. So your management, your fertiliser regimes, your crop rotation, your grazing intensity, whatever. And working at a cluster scale means that we all share those environmental constraints. We all have similar soil types, similar climate, similar topography. And so when you find differences in your baselining, whether it be in soil carbon or species richness, it's likely that you can identify things within our control, within our agency, that we can change, and we can be fairly confident that because we're comparing it to a farm over the hedge or down the road, that we will see similar effects because we're working in the same environment. So a challenge and an opportunity. And that's why personally our team is really excited to be working in the cluster, because I think it's the sweet spot, it's the scale as scientists interested in sustainable systems we should be working at. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'll introduce you to the soil carbon baselining work we did here a year ago, 18 months ago now. And we started off, our starting point was fields in food production. So we're interested in identifying the range of soil carbon within arable fields and permanent pasture fields that are managed for livestock or silage. So the contrast there is, generally we know that arable fields have lower soil carbon than grassland fields because you have bare earth, you have soil disturbance, you have lower organic inputs, you're taking carbon off all the time in harvests, in comparison to grassland fields where you have all-round living roots, you have higher plant inputs and organic inputs. So we know we're going to see that big contrast, but we're interested in, within those two big categories, what's the range across the cluster? Can we baseline the differences between the fields? So the real, I think, novelty and the value of the data we've got is its scale. So I think in the Carbon Quest database now we have in the region of 800, probably close to 1,000 fields now, or land parcels. So each of those land parcels we know about where it is geospatially, we know its soil type, we know its soil texture, we know its topography. And when we did this initial baselining survey, so what I need you to have in mind all the time is the real key to the work we're talking about today is the number of fields we've sampled, the scale of our data set within the cluster. So we've got a very good picture or overall representation of what's happening out there. So all of those blue dots, as Tim has already introduced, is an individual land parcel, and we selected those land parcels based on what we knew about the soil types. So we had our arable fields and our grassland fields, and we made sure we selected fields that represented all of the different soil types. So if we had a particular soil type like Elmton, which covered a lot of the catchment or the cluster, we did proportionally more samples in that. So we tried to design our sampling scheme in a way that gave you a really good representation of what was going on out there. And if you're familiar with these, I'm hoping this isn't too sciencey with too many graphs, but I'll try and walk through them. You should be familiar with these soil texture triangles, so clay, silt and sand. And as I'll mention in a moment, we know that soil texture is really important for determining how much carbon you can store and your potential to store more. So these are the soil types represented in the cluster. You might recognise some of those. And what this slide illustrates is just the differences between those in terms of going from sandy clay loams up to silty clays. So we've got quite a range of soils. But again, the important thing is that in our data we represent all those. So in a moment I'll talk about how we did the comparison of the fields, and you need to take into account the fact that you're only comparing soils like for like, you're not comparing apples with oranges. So we've got a good representation of the soil types and the variability out there. And then what we did, so we selected all those land parcels based on the proportional selection in the soil types, and then we used this kind of wagon wheel design. You're probably familiar with W's, where people sample soil carbon in fields. We've settled on this wagon wheel design where you identify a centre point and then use a compass to look at the points at each of those northeast, southwest points. The advantage of this is you can go straight to that, back to that exact point. So if we're talking about MRV protocols and monitoring the uplifting carbon maybe in 5 years' time as part of a project or a land use change, we can go back to exactly the same point and see how the carbon has changed. We sample at 2 depths, so that circle covers 100 square metres, and I'll say we've got between 700 and 800 of those data from those individual points. And then we sample at 2 depths, 0 to 10 and 10 to 30. We can have a discussion perhaps later about whether we should be going deeper and the value of going deeper. And then this last point is really, really important if we're talking about soil stocks. It may be familiar to lots of you here, but if you just do percentage soil carbon, the absolute amount of carbon you've got in your field will be related to the physical amount of soil that you've got. And that is measured by the bulk density. So if you're going down to 30 centimetres, how fluffy or how compacted is your soil? If your soil is very light and fluffy, there's physically less soil in that 30 centimetres per hectare than there is if you've got very squashed and compacted soil. So to measure that, we use something called bulk density, which is the weight of the soil. We take all the stones out, we dry it, and then we weigh it, and we have a set volume, so it's the density of that soil. So obviously if you've got the same percentage carbon, 3%, and you've got high bulk density, you've got more carbon, physically you've got more carbon in that soil than if you've got low bulk density, you've got less soil carbon in that soil. So you need to know the bulk density to estimate your stocks, how much carbon you've got in your field. So that's really important as well. And for all our hundreds of data points, we also have bulk density as well as texture, which is important. So, I hesitate to put these graphs up, but hopefully it's illustrative of what I've been saying. So these are box plots, and each of the, have we got a pointer? Yeah, there we go. So these are your different soil types, and in this case, this is the percentage soil organic carbon. So you see it goes down from about, a poor arable field will be about 1–1.5% soil carbon. A really good grassland field is up around 9 or 10. Okay, so that's the kind of range that we're looking at here. So first thing is, so each of these box plots, these are all the fields that we measured in arable in Aberford, all the fields that we measured in Badsey 1 in grassland. So the green is grassland and the orange is arable. So this is an illustration of the range we have in soil carbon in those different land use types and those different soil types. So it kind of justifies our approach of taking each soil type differently, and it also illustrates, so we've got, this is the shallow soil, this is the deep soil on this side. It also illustrates two things: the difference between the arable and the grassland. So the grassland is always higher carbon than the arable, so no great surprises there. And depth. So if you look at the overall soil carbon, shallow depth compared to the deep depth, we get more soil carbon in the shallow layer than the deep layer. Again, we know that. But then, importantly, the difference between the grassland and the arable is less at depth. So if you look at the difference between these two boxes, the orange box and the green box, say, let's just take ox pasture, but you could take any one. There's ox pasture there, you've got, this is actually the median, is around, 5 for arable and around 7 for grassland. If you look over here, the difference is much less between those two land use types. So, the difference in soil carbon between land use types and the effect of management is diluted with depth, generally. Okay, so the differences get less with depth. And then I've just pointed out those two different ways of measuring soil carbon that you'll see in some of the slides. Percentage SOC, and this carbon stock is the absolute amount of carbon you've got per hectare on the field. So far, so good. Do shout if there's any questions or anything that's not clear. But this is, again, it's kind of laying the groundwork for how we link all these carbon data into the water data in a moment. And then the last kind of fundamental principle that I want to introduce at this stage before coffee is this concept of the importance of soil texture in interpreting your field scale soil carbon results. So what we're about here is baselining and benchmarking fields. So we want to compare this field with that field, we want to compare this farm with that farm and say, okay, you're doing better, what are you doing different that means you've got more soil carbon, and what can I do? But to do that, these numbers are right, aren't they, Stefan? Thanks. but to do that, again, we need to compare like with like. And we know that the potential for a field to hold on to carbon, to store carbon, is related to its texture, specifically the proportion of clay particles, because the clay particles protect the carbon from microbial breakdown. They're a shield, if you like, for the carbon. So if you've got lots of clay in your soil, that carbon is less available to the microbes to break down and be lost. So you have a higher carbon storage potential. So if you've got, I don't know, 90 tonnes of carbon per hectare in this field and that field, but that field is very sandy and that field has got lots of clay, you can't compare them. You need to correct for the soil texture, which is where, I think Sally, you mentioned the importance of metrics, soil health metrics, which is where this metric is very useful, which is the soil organic carbon percentage divided by the clay percentage, the carbon to clay ratio. And it's a way of correcting for those differences in texture, and it allows you to compare fields with each other on the basis of their soil conditions. So we've identified these different categories, very good, good, moderate, or degraded, which accounts for those differences in soil texture. And again, because we've got all the texture data, we can do that for the cluster. Okay, so far so good. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Stefan, who's going to talk to us about how we tackle this problem of measuring all those fields in a cost-effective way. Thanks.
Hi, good morning everybody. Yes, so my name is Stefan Heffele, I work at Rothamsted in Harpenden, a bit north of London, and I basically represent Kathy today. Kathy Thomas is my colleague, and she did a lot of the work here, but she has to be in the field today. So yes, so the question for this project was baseline sampling at scale, is how can you measure thousands? I mean, in the moment it's more the hundreds, but I mean in the future it would be thousands. How can you measure so many samples a bit more economically and faster? And one way we are working on there is spectral analysis. So spectral analysis, you basically use light, so mid-infrared, near-infrared light, or X-ray fluorescence light, and you just shine the light on the sample, you measure the reflection, and you get a spectrum, which I show in a moment. And this is just to show that we have a range of methods or machines also using there. Some are bound to the lab, so we would still have to bring in the sample into the lab. Because we're also working here on the lower bottom on portable instruments, which we hope then can really help us to determine the carbon content and even the texture in the field, which would be the ideal situation. You could measure quickly in the field, measure also a bigger number of samples perhaps, and get better values. So this is examples of how the spectra looks. So over a whole range of wavelengths from 2,500 to 25,000 nanometers in that case. And you have different soils here, so each line is a different soil. And it gives you information about different characteristics of that soil. So for example, you can see up there is kaolin peak and the smectite peak. So these are clay minerals with different characteristics. By the way, clay minerals is it's the finest particle in the soil texture we know. So sand is relatively coarse, you can crunch it in your hands. Clay minerals get stuck in the rills in your fingerprint. But you can also see there's a calcite peak, actually quite important, because a lot of the soils here contain organic carbon, but also inorganic carbon, calcite, calcium carbonate. So you need to know that too. And then you have a big range up there which identifies your organic carbon. I mean, we are working for this project, we are mainly looking at soil organic carbon measurements, actually also inorganic carbon measurements and clay mineralogy to be used. But you can also use spectral analysis for other soil characteristics, mineral composition, iron oxides, organic matter, carbonates. Yeah. And this is an example from this project where we basically. Did you? I'm just a bit confused now. Okay.
Sorry, sir.
So one important aspect here is that to use these lines to actually give you a number from soil organic carbon, you need two things. You need reference samples where you have the carbon measured with conventional soil analytic. So that's your reference value, and you have these spectra. And then you actually need an algorithm to compare the two. So you couldn't do that. You can't measure a spectral measurement when you have a calibration for the region here, but your sample is from Scotland, right? So you need a local calibration. That's quite important. And that's what we try to do here, is basically to establish a calibration from measured organic carbon versus predicted carbon here for the Cotswold. And we did this, for example, in this case we did it for the machines in the lab, which are basically our gold standard, but we also did it for handheld tools, which is really the future where we want to go, improve that further so that we are faster there in these measurements. That's it, right?
Brilliant. We are doing very well on time, 5 to 11. I should do this chairing more often. So we've got 5 minutes till coffee. If you've got any quick points of clarification or anything else, I'd also just like to say a warm welcome, which was remiss of me to forget earlier, to some of the farm members as well. I won't single you out, but 3 or 4 of you have actually been really instrumental in allowing us to do some of this deeper dive analytics with the NEIRF 2 project that's about to come. So thank you very much for that. And just generally, we wouldn't be here today. This is quite a techie, sciencey meeting. Most of our meetings are in the field talking about crops and livestock in front of us. But without the farms and the farmer members, we just wouldn't have a cluster, obviously, and any of this science. So a big thank you to the farm members. So points of clarification or questions? We've got 3 hands up, so not really, I think. As I say, we are recording, so if you could hold your question until we've got a microphone, we'll be able to pick it up. Or just shout it out without the microphone if you don't want to be heard on the recording. So Lydia. And say your name and where you're from as well for the benefit.
Lydia Smith. I have a very boring technical question, Jonathan. Very quickly, when do you take your samples in the year? And do you take bulks at the top and at the bottom of your 30?
So the second question.
Answer to the microphone.
Oh, yes. Second question is yes. And first question, I can't remember.
Usually it's after the harvest.
Yeah, and that's what we do at Rothamsted, isn't it? In the stubbles.
Yes,
Yeah,
we also,
yeah.
it was same here.
Yeah, okay.
September.
Yeah.
But yeah, we do have the bulk densities in the 2 layers as well.
Hi, it's Adrian Temple-Brown from Wiltshire Climate Alliance. Key question, when you're doing the soil sampling, what's the cost per sample for a calibration type sample? And then for, say, a light-based sample,
This is where we need.
Under negotiation, I think it's the short answer to that.
Go on, Stefan.
I mean, I can't give you the exact costs now. It depends also a bit on the lab you would go, right? If you send your sample to NRM, approximately. I mean, the NRM sample for soil organic carbon is around £5, if I'm not quite wrong. Whereas we could do it for about £1 per pound, I would say, roughly.
I think it's fair to say there's a whole load of processing costs in between that as well. So if you were to send it off, Adrian, I think, what is it, £22 is it NRM for do maths? Up more, 25, 27, yeah, more. And bearing in mind we're doing 2 horizons here, so that's, you're looking at £55 odd to.
Sorry, my numbers were only for the analysis.
Yeah, just the analysis, exactly. So if you were to put it into a box and send it and then get the results back. So if you were to take out most of that process and be scanning it in the field, you're looking at 5 minutes. We're not quite refined that yet, have we, Adrian? But yes, it's the opportunity there to shave out so much of that cost. But obviously we still need the reference set, so there is still some cost involved. But at the moment, all of our samples have been going back to Rothamsted to make sure that we are building a robust set with the mind to reducing that cost by scanning it locally.
Tom with Rollred. Perhaps I misunderstood, but greater bulk density suggests that you can store more, sequester more carbon. Is that actually indicating that compaction is a good thing after all?
So one of the things that's going to keep coming up, I think, is as you build carbon, bulk density goes down because you get better soils, you get higher porosity, you get fluffier, spongier soils, which is what we want. And one of the issues we've come up against is because we have a standard depth of sampling, 30 centimetres, if you then build the carbon in that soil and you still sample to the same depth, you've got a lower bulk density, so you're actually underestimating how much extra carbon you're capturing because you've effectively built soil. It's like I tend to think of it as like a cake rising. Your soil's gone up. So to capture that extra carbon, you've actually got to sample a deeper horizon. So this is kind of something we're thinking about in the methodology, how you capture that. But no, generally, a lower bulk density is a better thing because you've got higher porosity. So although, as you're right, a compacted soil is squashing all that carbon into that layer, that's not a good thing. No. Yeah. Thank you. It's a really interesting question.
Hi there, David Fraser, River Tame Conservation Trust. I'm just interested, when you go from an arable situation to a grassland situation, arable reversion, you've obviously got some above ground carbon as well. How significant is that compared to the soil carbon that you're gaining?
Yes, it's a really good question and we haven't measured it. So I think we need other people to help with that. We've just focused on below ground. But I think I'm increasingly becoming interested in the above ground productivity angle. From my point of view, from a biodiversity angle, so I was looking at the floodplain meadow data and the species richness in the plant communities. So there's obviously a production angle to that as well. So no, we don't. I don't think we have the answers to that, do we?
No, we don't. But we did go back to our original trial site, Stratton Park Farms over in Essex, 2,500 hectares, where we basically tested the whole methodology and had some intensive trials there where you did take some biomass, but that's purely to work out what was going back into the soils.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the reason I personally have been backing this method is because once you go down to sort of 10 centimetres, you can't read a lot about the soils from the satellites. But above ground biomass, I think there's a real role for satellite measurement. And so I think what this is not the silver bullet to trading carbon and getting excited about that. It's a tool in combination with other methodologies. But the critical thing here is it's obviously more cost effective when you're underground.
Just a quick question for Stefan. It's Dave Gasker from Blenheim. I was quite interested in your little funky graph that showed all the different types of carbon and stuff. And just for us on the landowner side, we will contract labs of the type that you just described to do sort of standard SFI type surveys. I've noticed that different labs come back with different types of metrics on carbon. I guess the question I was asking more specifically was, you talked about those different types of carbon. In your experience and what you're doing here, how representative are these lab-based samples for people like us when we're trying to baseline our soils? And what should we be asking, I guess, commercial laboratories to help us within that context?
Well, that's not an easy one. I mean, the different types of carbon you have in one site, in one soil, is really like about how fast they break down. So you have fractionation of soil organic carbon you can do, and then you get different fractions which have different characteristics. Usually we wouldn't do that for really here we measure total carbon, total organic carbon. The next question there would be about metrics, and I do know commercial labs, they do offer different indices. I mean, the one we really worked on is this soil organic carbon clay index, and that's one we used across. So we used NSI samples from the National Soil Inventory, and so we have samples which cover the whole of England and Wales. And for this, we established that index as really, I mean, it's the best we have in the moment, which you can use across different soil types. So that's always, as Jon also said, I mean, it's difficult to compare that soil with this soil. And in that sense, that index is for us the most indicative of the current state of your soil. If it's really already okay and doing quite well, or if there is room for improvement. I mean, perhaps that's also something will come up later, I suppose, again. It's like, of course, it's easier to improve your soils if you are in the degraded part. Right? If your soil doesn't have a lot of carbon, to get it up is easier than it's very high, and the danger is more that you lose carbon. So in that sense, that's where we use that index, and where I say it helps most. But it's not about different components, it's about total soil organic carbon.
Brilliant. We are now starting to eat into your coffee time, so let's hold any more questions to discussion at the end, but thanks very much for a really rich few questions there. So back in your seats in 20 minutes would be fantastic, 25 a little bit.